Hey everybody, so today we're going to be learning from Chapter 2, Lesson 3, Percents and Decimals. This video today is dedicated to all my subscribers. Thank you for subscribing and supporting the channel of learning. Okay, so Chapter 2, Lesson 3, Percents and Decimals, we're really building off of Lessons 1 and 2. In Lessons 1 and 2, we learned how to go from a percent to a fraction or a fraction to a decimals. Here we're going to learn how to go from a percent to a decimal, and we're really going to just keep on using what we've been doing in lesson 1 and 2. So we're still going to be using those fractions to go to either a percent or decimal. I'll show you what I'm talking about. So make sure your notes look like mine. You got your main ideas in your notes column, and here we go. So first we're going to learn to write a percent as a decimal. So write a percent as a decimal. And the first percent that we're going to try working out is 15%. Okay, so when we're going from a percent to a decimal, or a decimal to a percent, the strategy that we want to use is you'll have to write all three of them out. So percent, fraction, and decimal. That's the strategy we're going to be using. Some of you may know shortcuts, and you don't need to show all 3%, fraction, decimal, but the work that I want to see you doing is all the work that I'm going to show here. Because before we can learn the shortcut way, we definitely want to learn to do it like this. So we're going to start with a percent. From percent, we're going to write it as a fraction. And from a fraction, we're going to write it as a decimal. Okay, so the percent that we have is 15%. And we first need to write this percent as a fraction. And what we've said, well, to do that first, what we know about percents will help us. So a percent, if we remember what we wrote, I believe it was lesson 2, maybe lesson 2, I believe. From lesson 2, remember that a percent means out of 100. Okay, so I'm going to put an equal sign because this is going to be equal. My percent and my fraction will be equal. They're just going to be written differently. So a percent is out of 100. So I'm going to make sure to set that up. So my fraction is halfway there. Now I need to put this percent as a fraction. So 15% equals 15 out of 100. Okay? Remember, percent is just out of 100, so 15 out of 100. And here I have it written. To get from a fraction to a decimal, all you need to do is divide the numerator and the denominator. Okay? This was from, I think this was from lesson 1. Okay, so we had to divide numerator by denominator, and we would get our decimal. So 15 divided by 100, you can use a calculator, you'll get 0.15. Okay, so I want you guys using these 3 steps. You start with a percent, from a percent you go to a fraction, and from a fraction you go to a decimal. To go from a fraction to a decimal, you're going to divide numerator by denominator, and then that'll be your answer. So it's actually quite easy. Okay, you just got to use the strategies and show your work. Another thing is we have equal signs here because these are all equal. Okay, 15% is equal to 15 over 100, or out of 100, and 15 out of 100 is equal to 0.15. Okay, let's try another one. Let's try 2%. So 2% here. Again, I'm going to start with my percent. And I want to make this percent into a fraction. In order to do that, I need to know what percent means. Percent means out of 100. So if I read it as 2 out of 100, then the way I say it is the way I'm going to write it. 2 out of 100. And again, we know that with percents, when we're writing them as fractions, denominator is always 100 because it's out of 100. But if you're still confused on what to do next, just know that whatever number you have here, it's going to go right up here. Okay? So 2% equals 2 out of 100. And then we need to convert this fraction, or write this fraction as a decimal. So we're going to do numerator divided by denominator. And please use a calculator if you need one. 2 divided by 100 in your calculator, you'll get 0.02. And that's our decimal. Okay, that's our answer. So I'm going to highlight a couple things. So write a percent as a decimal, and this strategy here is going to help us do that. Again, no shortcuts. This is what I expect to see when you guys are taking the test. Okay, so percent, go to fraction. From fraction, you go to a decimal. Okay, let's learn a different strategy now. Pretty much the same, but now, so we've learned how to write a percent as a decimal. Now we need to learn how to write a decimal as a percent. Okay, so I need to write a decimal as a percent. This new strategy, very similar to this one. Now we're just going in the opposite direction. Okay, so we would start with a decimal and go to a percent. So start with a decimal. From a decimal, we're going to go to a fraction. And from a fraction, we're going to go to a percent. So again, we're tying everything we know from lesson 1 and 2 to complete lesson 3. Okay? In order to go from a decimal to a fraction, you have to be able to understand lesson 1. To go from a fraction to a percent, you need to be able to understand and have taken notes from lesson 2. Okay, so let's say we have the decimal 0.3. I'm going to move the camera a little bit. Okay. So if we have the decimal 0.3, we're going to set it up the same way that we were setting this up. We're going to start with the first thing it tells us to start, which is our decimal. Okay, so here we have our decimal. First thing I want you to do is place this into a little place value chart. It doesn't have to be a big one, and you can actually just make the underlined lines right under the number. So, and I have my decimal here. So 0.3, that's something I want to see you doing on your test so that I know that you know where the place values, where the numbers are supposed to go on the place value chart. And you can even do it on the side here. You know that 0.3, maybe it's supposed to go there. Okay? So don't forget to be doing that. So 0.3, I know that the way that I say it is the way I'm going to write it. So I'm going to ignore this 0 because I don't really need to say it. I'm going to ignore the decimal. Remember, we would pronounce the decimal as and. In this case, since I don't have like a number 1 or 2 here, I don't need to be saying the 0 or the decimal because it's just not necessary. So I'm just going to say this number and then where it's placed on the place value chart. 3/10. This is in the tenth spot, so I'm going to say it as 3/10. And the way that I say it is the way I'm going to write it. 3/10. Okay? Now, the hard part, which isn't really hard, okay, but it's the hardest part so far, is that we need a percent. And a percent is out of 100. So in order to get a percent that's out of 100, we need to set it up as a fraction that's out of 100. Okay, so this goes back to chapter 1 where we were learning rates and ratios. Okay, we would have a ratio or a rate and we would try to find the equivalent ratio or the rate. It's sort of the same thing we're doing here. We need to determine how can we get from 10 to 100. Because whatever we do here, we're going to do the same exact thing up here. Just by knowing my multiplication facts, I know that 10 times 10 would give me 100. If I didn't know that, I could go in the opposite direction and divide. Okay, so since I did 10 times 10 on the bottom, on the top, I'm going to do 3 times 10. And my answer is going to be 30. Okay, so now I have something out of 100 and it's ready to put into a percent. Now the very last step is just to write this number with a percent sign. Because again, saying 30 out of 100 here is the same as saying 30%, because percent still means out of 100. Okay, so in order to go from decimal to percent, we had to first start with the decimal, use place value chart to get our fraction. From our fraction, we needed to make sure that it was out of 100. Once we get it to be out of 100, then we can get our percent. Okay, last example. So let's do 0.16. Again, if I'm using my place value chart, I might set up some dashes here. 0.16. Okay, so let me put my decimal here. I'm going to start with my decimal, 0.16. The way I say it is the way I'm going to write it for my fraction. So I'm going to have an equal sign because again these are going to be equal and I need to make my fraction. So the way I say it is the way I write it. I'm going to ignore this, okay? So I'm not going to say 1/6. Don't say 1/6. Say 16, okay? If you had, just like we said 3/10 here, this is 1600ths. Okay, so 1600ths, because the last digit in the number is in the hundredth spot. So I have 1600ths. This works out perfectly because our fraction is already out of 100, so we don't need to do this extra step here. So 16 out of 100. Now I just need to put this fraction, say this fraction, as a percent. So I need to write it as a percent. So that means I'm going to take this number and I'm going to write a percent symbol next to it, because 16 out of 100 is the same as saying 16%. Alright everybody, so that was our last strategy for writing decimal as a percent. I'm just going to highlight a few things here. Decimal as a percent. We went from decimal to fraction, to percent, okay? And this is the strategy you should be using. Again, please don't be using any shortcuts, okay? Do it this way, and then once we master how to do it this way, and you've showed me that you can do it this way, then we can start using shortcuts. Have a good weekend.